Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. Edward here, glad to find you in this quiet corner of the day. Tell me, is there paper nearby? Perhaps a pen? The faint smell of ink in a still room? These are the details Watson noticed, the small, faithful textures of an attentive life. He understood, as his remarkable companion always insisted, that truth rarely announces itself. It waits, patient and silent, inside the overlooked particular. Do subscribe to Watson's Margins, so no detail escapes you. Now settle gently in, for as Holmes observed, it is the absence of a thing, quite as much as its presence, that tells us everything. You'll find our Spotify channel in the description below. Why, do join us there. Chapter 1. Fog on Baker Street. It is a peculiarity of my long association with Mr. Sherlock Holmes that the cases most worthy of record have arrived not in moments of drama or outcry, Rigi was teary, but during those quiet evenings when Baker Street lay wrapped in its own grey silence, and Holmes himself appeared to the casual observer as nothing more than a lean figure in a mouse-coloured dressing gown, adrift in some private ocean of thought. It was on precisely such an evening, in the second week of November, that the affair I have chosen to set down under the title of the Unsigned Confession first presented itself to our attention. The fog had descended upon London with unusual thoroughness that Tuesday. I'd remarked upon it earlier in the afternoon, when I stepped briefly into Baker Street on an errand, and found that the gas lamps along the pavement were reduced to nothing more than pale, sickly aureoles of amber suspended in the murk, their light swallowed before it could accomplish any useful purpose. The carriages moved at a crawl, their drivers leaning forward with an air of strained concentration, and the usual sounds of the city reached one's ears in a strangely muffled form, as though the world beyond a radius of 10 yards had ceased to exist altogether. I was glad enough to return to the sitting room of 221B, where Mrs. Hudson had seen to it that the fire burned at its most generous. I settled into my customary chair and took up the notes I had been compiling on a previous matter, a business concerning a missing heirloom and a duplicitous valet, which Holmes had resolved some weeks earlier with his characteristic economy of effort. I was engaged in setting the salient points in order, for it has always been my practice to commit these cases to record while the details remain reasonably fresh. Holmes, for his part, had assumed that attitude which I knew from experience to indicate not idleness, but a peculiar form of concentrated inactivity. He was reclining in his armchair with his violin across his knee, or drawing the bow across the strings in a series of long contemplative notes that bore no resemblance to any recognised melody. It was not music in any conventional sense, yet there was a kind of searching intelligence in the sound, as if Holmes were conducting some internal inquiry in which the violin served as a sounding board rather than an instrument of entertainment. I had long since ceased to find the habit irritating. It was simply one of the many outward signs that Sherlock Holmes was, in some deep and inaccessible region of his remarkable mind, very much at work. The clock on the mantelpiece showed 8:15 when we heard the bell below, followed by the measured tread of Mrs. Hudson ascending the stairs. Holmes did not alter his posture, though I observed his eyes open fully and fix themselves upon the door with the quality of attention that a cat might give to a mouse-hole. "We have a visitor," he remarked, as though the fact were of mild academic interest. "So it would appear," I said, "a professional man." The bell was pulled with deliberate restraint, the action of someone accustomed to conducting himself with formality even in moments of personal difficulty. Note also that Mrs. Hudson has not hurried. She therefore does not perceive any cause for alarm. Our visitor is respectable, composed, and has stated his business clearly enough to satisfy her judgment. I had no opportunity to respond before Mrs. Hudson opened the door and announced, in her customary manner, that a Mr. Lionel Pritchard was below and wished to consult Mr. Holmes on a matter of some delicacy, if Mr. Holmes could spare the time. Holmes set the violin aside with the unhurried precision of a man replacing a valued but not urgently required instrument. "Show him up, Mrs. Hudson," he said. The gentleman who entered a moment later was a man of perhaps 55 years, well but not ostentatiously dressed, with the careful bearing of a solicitor who has spent a lifetime in the management of other people's difficulties. His face was long and clean-shaven, wearing an expression of controlled anxiety that spoke of a mind wrestling with something it had not yet fully resolved. He carried a leather document case of good quality, and in his gloved left hand he held his hat, which he turned with unconscious regularity as he crossed the threshold. "Mr. Holmes," he said, "I am grateful you are able to receive me at this hour. I am Lionel Pritchard, of the firm Pritchard & Ellsworth Solicitors, with offices in Gray's Inn Road. I must confess at the outset that the matter I bring to you is one for which I have very little professional precedent, and I find myself unable, in good conscience, to proceed without the guidance of someone whose judgment I have long admired from a considerable distance." Holmes gestured toward the basket chair and resumed his own seat. "Sit down, Mr. Pritchard. This is my colleague Dr. Watson, before whom you may speak with complete freedom. You have come a considerable distance this evening. The fog has been thickening since 6 o'clock. Mr. Pritchard settled himself and placed his document case upon his knee. "You are correct, Mr. Holmes. I confess the journey gave me pause, but the matter would not allow of delay." "Then let us have it plainly," Holmes said. Mr. Pritchard opened his case and drew from it a single sheet of paper, which he held with some care, as though its physical condition were a matter of importance. He extended it toward Holmes, who took it without haste and held it toward the lamp. I leaned forward in my chair. The document was a single page of good quality writing paper, and covered on one side in a firm and legible hand. Holmes read it through twice in silence, his long fingers holding the edges with the precision of a man conscious that paper can yield information beyond its written text. "You will permit me to read it aloud for Watson's benefit," he said. It was not a question. "By all means," said Pritchard. Holmes read in an even voice without inflection. The document was a confession, written in the first person, acknowledging responsibility for a fraudulent transaction conducted in partnership with a named business associate some 19 years earlier. The sum involved was substantial. The moral tone of the writing was that of a man attempting at considerable cost to his own pride to set the record of his conscience straight. There was, however, no signature. Holmes lowered the page and regarded our visitor with calm attention. "The recently deceased Sir Malcolm Denning," he said. "This was found among his personal papers." Mr. Pritchard looked briefly startled, then permitted himself a small, resigned nod. "You're quite correct, Mr. Holmes. Sir Malcolm died 4 days ago. The official cause of death was heart failure. He was 63 years of age and had been in uncertain health for some months. The discovery of this document was made during the preliminary examination of his papers. The executor of his estate, who was a client of our firm, referred it immediately to my attention." "The absence of a signature," Holmes said. "Tell me your thoughts on that point, Mr. Pritchard." The solicitor spread his hands in a gesture of professional helplessness. "That is precisely the difficulty. If it is signed, the document becomes a matter of public record with potential legal consequences for the estate and for those who are named within it. Without a signature, it is merely an anomaly, an ambiguity, and yet it exists. It was found in Sir Malcolm's private writing desk, in a locked drawer. The question of its authorship cannot be set aside. Who had access to the house in the period immediately preceding Sir Malcolm's death?" Mr. Pritchard reached once more into his document case and produced a folded sheet of notepaper. 3 persons principally. Mrs. Eleanor Denning, the widow. She is a reserved and dignified woman who has expressed the belief that the document is either a fabrication or the product of some temporary disorder of her husband's mind in his final weeks. Mr. Arthur Linton, who served as Sir Malcolm's personal secretary for a period of 7 years. He has been entirely cooperative and has offered every assistance. And Captain Gregory Hale, a military acquaintance of some long standing, who has called at the house on several occasions in recent months. Captain Hale's response to inquiries about the document has been notably less composed. Holmes handed the confession back to Mr. Pritchard and pressed his fingertips together beneath his chin. For a moment he said nothing, and I knew that quality of silence well enough to remain quiet myself. The unsigned nature of this confession is not, as you appear to assume, an accident or an oversight, Holmes said at last. It is the single, most significant feature of the entire document. A man writing to discharge his conscience does not omit his name by carelessness. The absence of that signature is itself a statement. What it states, however, remains to be established. He rose and moved to the window, drawing aside the curtain to look out at the fog-wrapped street below. The yellow light of the nearest lamp swam in the murk like a lantern at the bottom of a harbour. "I shall look into this matter, Mr. Pritchard," he said quietly. "Be good enough to arrange for Watson and me to visit the Denning house in Mayfair tomorrow morning. Ensure that Mrs. Denning, Mr. Linton and Captain Hale are all present or available for interview. Bring the full inventory of items found in or about Sir Malcolm's writing desk, and do not permit anything in that room to be moved or disturbed before our arrival." Mr. Pritchard rose, visibly relieved. "I am most grateful, Mr. Holmes." When he had gone, Holmes stood for a long moment with his back to me, still regarding the fog. "Holmes," I ventured, "what is it about this case that interests you? The man has died of heart failure. The confession may be entirely genuine, and there are 3 obvious suspects to account for the document. It does not appear on its surface especially difficult." "On its surface," Holmes repeated. "Precisely, Watson. It is below the surface that I expect we shall find the truly instructive material." He turned from the window and lifted his violin again. "A man may write 1,000 words of confession and reveal very little. But the detail he omits, or the detail that does not agree with the facts around it, that is where the truth lives." He began to play once more, and the fog pressed itself against the windows of Baker Street as if listening. Chapter 2. The Circle Around Denning. The fog had not entirely lifted by morning, though it had thinned to a pale, luminous haze that softened the edges of the Mayfair streets and lent to the stuccoed terraces an almost spectral quality. Holmes and I took a cab from Baker Street shortly after 9, and I noticed that he had dressed with rather more care than his habits ordinarily demanded, exchanging the dressing gown and disarray of the previous evening for a dark frock coat and the alert and composed bearing he adopted whenever a case required him to observe people who might, in turn, observe him. He spoke very little during the journey. I had learned, through years of close association, that this silence was not inattentiveness, but its opposite. Holmes was, I suspected, constructing the architecture of his inquiry before a single brick of fresh evidence had been laid before him, preparing the questions whose answers would either confirm or dismantle whatever provisional framework he had erected during the night. Whether he had slept at all was a matter I did not pursue. The Denning house stood in a quiet terrace not far from Berkeley Square, a handsome property of the late Georgian period that had been maintained with the impersonal exactness of a household managed by competent servants rather than one animated by particular warmth. The railings were freshly painted, the steps immaculate, the brass fittings on the door polished to a severity that suggested habit rather than pride. A house of order, I thought, or perhaps of performance. Mr. Pritchard met us at the door and conducted us into a morning room on the ground floor where the blinds had been drawn to half their height in acknowledgment of the bereavement. The room was furnished with the heavy, earnest solidity of a prosperous household of the preceding decade. Dark oak, good carpets, and framed engravings of no particular distinction. On the mantelpiece, a portrait photograph of Sir Malcolm Denning himself in middle age looked out with the expression of guarded self-possession common to men who have spent their working lives in the direction of financial affairs. Mrs. Eleanor Denning received us first. She was a woman of perhaps 50, slender and still handsome, dressed in the fresh black of recent mourning with no ornament of any kind. She seated herself with a composed precision that made me think of someone who has rehearsed a difficult performance and is resolved to carry it through without visible effort. Her grief, if it was present, had been placed somewhere inaccessible, at least to the scrutiny of strangers. "Mr. Holmes," she said with a civil inclination of her head, "I am grateful that my husband's affairs have been placed in capable hands, though I confess I regard this particular document as unworthy of the weight being attached to it." "You believe it to be a fabrication?" Holmes said. "I believe it to be an impossibility," she replied, with a precision that distinguished the two positions. "My husband was a man of strict principle. Whatever difficulties he may have faced in his earlier career, he confronted them honestly. He told me as much himself some years ago, when certain matters arose which I need not specify. The idea that he bore some undischarged burden of guilt sufficient to produce a written confession is entirely inconsistent with the man I knew for 26 years. He had become withdrawn in recent months, Holmes observed, troubled, according to Mr. Pritchard's account. A shadow passed briefly across Mrs. Denning's face, the first crack in her composure. He was not well. His heart had been a source of concern to his physician since the spring. I attributed his quietness to that. She paused. He did not confide everything to me. I do not think it any reflection on our marriage to acknowledge that a man of his temperament kept a portion of himself private. Holmes thanked her with a brevity that was itself a form of courtesy, and asked that she make Mr. Linton available to us. Arthur Linton was a man of 32 or thereabouts, fair-haired and neat in his movements, with the slightly over-attentive manner of someone who has long been employed in the service of a more powerful personality, and has shaped his own habits accordingly. He met Holmes's gaze directly and without apparent discomfort, and he answered each question with the smooth efficiency of a man who has already organised his recollections into something approaching a formal statement. "I discovered the document on the morning following Sir Malcolm's death," he said. "I had been asked by Mrs. Denning to locate certain correspondence concerning the estate, and in the course of going through the writing desk in his study, I found it in the locked lower drawer. The key to that drawer was kept on Sir Malcolm's watch chain." "Was the drawer locked when you opened it?" "It was. I used the key from his watch chain. Mrs. Denning had given me leave to do so. And the document was simply lying there, unfolded." Linton hesitated for just a moment. A pause so brief that I might have attributed it to nothing more than a careful memory. "It was folded once, and placed beneath a bundle of older correspondence." Holmes nodded slowly, as if this were an entirely unremarkable detail, and moved on to the question of Sir Malcolm's final days. Linton's account was, as Mr. Pritchard had suggested, comprehensively useful. He provided the dates and approximate durations of each visitor's call in the preceding fortnight, the sequence of Sir Malcolm's professional appointments, the names of his physician and his club, and the occasions on which his employer had appeared particularly agitated or unwell. All of this was delivered with a fluency and completeness that was, I admit, impressive. Holmes listened throughout with his eyes partially closed and his fingers motionless. When Linton had finished, Holmes thanked him and allowed a silence of some seconds to settle in the room before remarking, almost as an afterthought, that he would like to look at the study before seeing Captain Hale. Captain Gregory Hale, who had been waiting in a smaller room at the rear of the house, was a man of a very different constitution from either of the two we had previously interviewed. He was broad-shouldered and weathered, with close-cropped grey hair, and the kind of face that has spent time in climates less forgiving than England's. His agitation was barely contained. He stood rather than sat, and when Holmes entered the room he fixed him with a look that was partly challenging and partly, I thought, frightened. "I have already told Pritchard everything I know," he said, before Holmes had spoken a word. "Which is precisely nothing. I have no idea what that document is or how it came to be where it was found." "You're aware of the financial matter to which it refers," Holmes said. It was not a question. Hale's jaw tightened. "I am aware of certain events of 20 years ago in which both Denning and I were peripherally involved. If that is what the document concerns, then I can tell you that Malcolm Denning behaved honourably throughout, and that any suggestion otherwise is a lie designed to damage a man who can no longer defend himself. Who might wish to damage him? I don't know. I've asked myself the same question for 4 days." He turned toward the window and I saw his hands close behind his back. Malcolm was not a man who made enemies lightly, but there were people who stood to benefit from certain arrangements he had put in place. Old arrangements, I should leave it at that. Holmes appeared content to do so, at least for the present. He thanked Captain Hale with the same courteous economy he had extended to the others, and within a few minutes we were standing in Sir Malcolm Denning's study. It was a well-proportioned room overlooking the rear garden, lined on 2 walls with bookshelves and furnished with a large writing desk positioned to receive the light from the window. The desk was of fine mahogany, with a green leather surface and the usual appointments of an industrious man: a blotter, an inkstand, a pen tray, and a small brass lamp. A correspondence basket at the right-hand side contained a modest quantity of unattended papers. Holmes moved to the desk without haste and stood before it for a long moment, his gaze moving across its surface with the systematic attention of a man reading a map. He did not touch anything immediately. He looked at the arrangement of the objects, at the blotter and its surface, at the pen tray and the inkstand. Then he crouched slightly and examined the leather surface at an angle to the light. I watched him, as I had watched him 100 times before in moments such as this, and I was struck, not for the first time, by the curious quality of stillness he brought to the act of observation. There was no theatre in it, no flourish. He simply looked, with the complete and patient attention of a mind that has never learned to regard any detail as beneath consideration. After, perhaps 3 minutes, he straightened. "You have noticed nothing in particular?" I asked. "On the contrary," he said quietly, and moved to the blotter, which he studied with particular care. "I have noticed a considerable amount, Watson. Whether it amounts to anything of importance, I shall require a little more time to determine." He cast a brief glance at the fireplace, where the grate held the remnants of a recent fire, and, among the ash, the darkened, curled edge of what appeared to be a fragment of burnt paper. "But I begin," he added, "to find this case rather more interesting than it presented itself last night." He said nothing further until we were back in the cab, heading north through the thinning morning haze toward Baker Street. Chapter 3: The Death That Changed Everything. Holmes maintained his silence for the greater part of the journey back to Baker Street, and I had the impression that he was not so much thinking as listening to something inward, some arrangement of newly gathered facts settling into their provisional positions. I occupied myself with my own reflections, which were of a more straightforward kind. The 3 interviews had left me with the clear impression of a household still in the early, disorienting hours of bereavement, in which the ordinary social arrangements had been suspended and replaced by a watchful, uneasy proximity among people who would not ordinarily have chosen to spend time in one another's company. It was not until we had returned to Baker Street and Mrs. Hudson had brought up the mid-morning tray that Holmes spoke with any substance. "What did you make of them?" he asked, in the offhand tone he used when the question was not as casual as it sounded. "Mrs. Denning struck me as a woman of considerable self-command," I said. "Whether that self-command conceals grief or something else, I could not say with confidence. Linton is helpful to a degree that I found myself almost wishing he were less so, and Hale is frightened, though he would strongly object to the word." Holmes poured his tea with the absent air of a man performing a mechanical function. "Your observations are, as usual, sound in their general outline and somewhat underdeveloped in their implications, but we shall come to that." He set the cup down without drinking from it. "What struck you about the study itself?" I considered. "The burnt paper in the grate, the blotter, which you examined at some length, the general orderliness of the desk, which seemed consistent with a man who kept his affairs in careful arrangement, and the inkstand." I confessed that the inkstand had not attracted my particular attention. Holmes said nothing in reply, which was, in its way, more instructive than any comment he might have made. He rose and moved to the window, where he stood for a moment looking down at Baker Street, with his hands thrust into the pockets of his coat. Then he turned and said, with the abruptness that characterized his transitions between contemplation and action, "I am expecting a message from Lestrade. I took the liberty of sending him a note this morning before we left. Lestrade, I said, with some surprise, is the police already involved? They became involved the day before yesterday, Holmes replied, resuming his chair. Pritchard omitted to mention it, either from professional caution or because he did not think it relevant. I suspect the former. The death of a prominent man is seldom left entirely to private examination, when a document of the kind we have seen is found among his papers within 24 hours of his collapse. The message arrived within the hour, delivered by a constable who received his shilling and departed without ceremony. Holmes read it, folded it with precision, and placed it on the mantelpiece. Lestrade will be here at 3 o'clock, he said. In the meantime, Watson, I should be grateful if you would consult your medical knowledge on a specific point. A man of 63 with a documented history of cardiac weakness receives a visit or a communication of a sufficiently disturbing nature. He collapses and dies. His physician certifies heart failure. At what point does such a death require further scrutiny? I gave the question the consideration it deserved. If there are no marks of violence, and if the history of cardiac weakness is well established and corroborated by a reputable physician, then heart failure as a cause of death is entirely plausible and would ordinarily satisfy any reasonable inquiry. The disturbing event, whatever its nature, would be considered a precipitating factor rather than a cause. Precipitating, Holmes repeated, as though the word had a flavour he wished to examine. Yes, I think that is precisely the right word. Inspector Lestrade arrived punctually, which was more than could always be said, and settled himself into the basket chair with the air of a man who has reached a satisfying conclusion and intends to share it generously. He was a lean, dark, ferrety figure, persistent where Holmes was intuitive, and in his own professional domain not without a certain practical competence, though his instinct was to move toward the most visible explanation with a directness that sometimes served him well and sometimes carried him confidently past the truth. "Well, Mr. Holmes," he said, after the initial civilities had been dispensed with, "I imagine Pritchard has brought you into this business. I won't pretend I'm surprised. It's the sort of thing that finds its way to you." He produced his notebook with the purposeful air of a man about to deliver good news. "I can tell you that our inquiries have moved along rather quickly. The death of Sir Malcolm Denning, combined with the nature of that document, has opened up a line of investigation that points, fairly directly, to Captain Gregory Hale." "On what grounds?" Holmes asked. His tone was entirely neutral. "Motive and opportunity, Mr. Holmes. We've established that Denning and Hale had a connection going back to their younger years, involving a financial affair that was never properly resolved. Hale has debts, serious ones. We have a theory that Hale used knowledge of the old business to put pressure on Denning, and that when Denning refused to cooperate, or perhaps threatened to expose the arrangement, a confrontation took place that proved fatal. The confession, in Lestrade's view, was produced under some form of coercion to serve Hale's purposes." "Lestrade's view," Holmes observed, with a faint dryness that the inspector either did not notice or chose to ignore. "My view? Yes," Lestrade continued, unabashed. "Hale's manner when questioned was anything but that of an innocent man. He was angry, evasive, and refused to account fully for his movements on the evening of Denning's death." I leaned forward. "You have reason to believe he was at the house that evening?" "We're pursuing that line," Lestrade said, with the careful phrasing of a man who has a witness in prospect but not yet in hand. "I expect to have something more definitive within a day or two." Holmes had been quiet throughout this account, his chin resting on his steepled fingers and his gaze directed at a point slightly above and beyond Lestrade's left shoulder. When he spoke, his manner was measured and entirely without condescension, which I recognized as a sign that he was keeping something in reserve. "You have established, I take it, the precise sequence of events on the night of Sir Malcolm's death, the time of his collapse, who was present, who was informed, and what occurred in the study between that moment and the discovery of the document the following morning." Lestrade consulted his notebook. "Denning was found by his butler, a man named Graves, at approximately 9:30 in the evening in the study. He was unresponsive. The physician was summoned and arrived within the half-hour. Death was pronounced at 10 minutes past 10. Mrs. Denning was in the drawing-room throughout. Linton had left the house at 7. Hale's movements are as yet unaccounted for. And the study itself? Was it left undisturbed between the time of Denning's collapse and the following morning? A brief hesitation. The butler remained in the vicinity. Mrs. Denning looked in once briefly with the physician. No one, to our knowledge, entered the room and remained there at any length. To your knowledge, Holmes said. To our knowledge, Lestrade confirmed, with slightly less assurance than before. Holmes rose and moved to the fireplace, where he stood with one arm resting on the mantelpiece, regarding the inspector with an expression of courteous patience. I do not dispute your theory concerning Hale, Lestrade. His temperament and his financial position make him a plausible subject of interest, and I would not advise you to abandon that line of inquiry. But I would ask you to address one question before you proceed further. He paused. The confession was found the morning after Denning's death in a locked drawer by Mr. Linton, using a key taken from the dead man's watch chain. What became of that key after Linton used it? Lestrade blinked. I expect it was returned to the chain. You expect, Holmes said with the gentlest possible emphasis. I should like to know. After Lestrade had taken his leave, with an expression suggesting he considered the question about the key a minor administrative matter, I turned to Holmes and found him already at his desk, pulling toward him a sheet of paper on which he had, at some earlier point, made several small notations in pencil. You do not think Hale killed him, I said. I think, Holmes replied carefully without looking up, that Hale is a great deal easier to suspect than the alternative, and in my experience, Watson, is a The easiest explanation and the correct one are related to one another with far less regularity than the popular imagination supposes. He drew a fine line beneath whatever he had written, set the pencil down and reached for his pipe. The death that changed everything, he said quietly, more to himself than to me, was not Denning's. Or rather, it was not only Denning's. The question we have not yet thought to ask is what else changed on the night he died, and who, among those in that house, stood to gain from the particular direction in which events have since moved. The fire settled in the grate, and the fog which had returned with the afternoon pressed once more against the windows of Baker Street. Chapter 4. The Overlooked Object. Holmes was gone before I had risen the following morning. Mrs. Hudson informed me, with the resigned air of a woman long accustomed to irregular household arrangements, that he had breakfasted at 6:30 and departed shortly thereafter, carrying only his coat and his magnifying lens. She did not know his destination, and I did not suppose he had offered one. He returned at 11:30, hung his coat on the stand with the unhurried movements of a man who has accomplished something useful, and asked Mrs. Hudson for coffee, in a tone that suggested he had been doing light reading rather than conducting inquiries across the better part of London on a damp November morning. I had spent the intervening hours in a manner I'm not especially proud to record, having attempted twice to settle to the morning papers, and finding on each occasion that my thoughts drifted back to the study in the Mayfair house, to the blotter on Denning's desk and the curl of burnt paper in the grate, and to Holmes's question about the key that had not yet been accounted for. There is a particular frustration in being an attentive partner to a mind of Holmes's quality, which is that one gathers enough to know that there is something to be found, but not quite enough to find it. When Holmes came in and dropped into his armchair with a long, satisfied exhalation, I set down the papers with more relief than I would have cared to show. "You have been back to the house," I said. "I have been back to the house," he agreed. "Pritchard was good enough to arrange access for me at short notice, and Mrs. Denning, to her considerable credit, made no objection to my spending rather more time in the study than a casual visitor might require. She's a woman who has decided that the truth, whatever it proves to be, is preferable to further uncertainty. I found that determination admirable. And what did the study yield?" Holmes accepted his coffee from Mrs. Hudson. He was waited until she had withdrawn, and then leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and the cup held between his palms. It was the posture he adopted when he wished to speak precisely and without theatrical effect, and I gave him my full attention. "Let us begin with the blotter," he said. "You will recall that I examined it yesterday with some care. The surface of a well-used desk blotter is, for the observant eye, a document in its own right. It accumulates the faint reversed impressions of whatever has been written upon the desk above it, particularly when the writer presses with any degree of firmness. Yesterday, I noted the presence of certain indentations that I could not, in the time available, resolve into legible content. This morning I returned with graphite and a sheet of thin paper. I knew the technique, having seen him employ it on at least 2 previous occasions. By laying the paper flat over the blotter and rubbing graphite lightly across its surface, the underlying impressions were revealed as pale lines against the darkened ground, legible if one held the sheet at the correct angle to the light. The results, Holmes continued, were instructive in a specific and somewhat unexpected respect. There were, as one would anticipate, multiple layers of impression, corresponding to letters and documents written at different times. Yet most were too fragmentary or too overlaid to interpret with any confidence. But one passage was sufficiently clear to read, and it corresponded in its phrasing and its general construction to several sentences from the Unsigned Confession. He paused. "Which would appear, at first consideration, to confirm that the confession was written at that desk." "But you do not find it confirming," I said, reading his expression with the familiarity of a long practice. "I find it suggestive in a different direction entirely," Holmes said. "Watson, when a man sits at his own desk and writes a private document of great personal significance, he writes it with the natural fluid pressure of a hand that belongs in that chair, at that desk, using those materials. The impressions left on a blotter by such a document are themselves organic, variable, the product of a hand that accelerates and slows and presses harder at moments of feeling. What I found on that blotter this morning was something quite different. The impressions were uniform in their depth and even in their spacing, as though the hand that made them was working with deliberate, controlled effort. Not the writing of a man discharging his conscience, Watson. The writing of a man copying." I turned this over carefully. "You're suggesting that the confession visible on the blotter is not the original document, but a copy. That someone sat at Denning's desk and reproduced it." "I am suggesting that the blotter evidence was arranged," Holmes said, setting his cup down, "which is a rather different and considerably more troubling proposition." He rose and moved to the desk in the corner of the sitting room, where he had placed, I now noticed, several objects brought back from his morning excursion. Among them was a sheet of paper on which he had transferred the graphite impressions from the blotter, and beside it, a page I recognised as a careful transcription of the Unsigned Confession, as read to us by Pritchard 2 evenings before. Holmes laid the 2 sheets side by side and invited me to examine them. The resemblance was unmistakable. Several phrases appeared in both, sufficiently distinct in their wording to rule out coincidence. "Now look here," Holmes said, and indicated with one long finger a point toward the lower portion of the blotter impression. "Ndiaskiyi," the final sentence of the passage. In the confession as presented to us it reads as a complete statement, fully stopped. On the blotter, the same sentence trails away without conclusion, as though the hand that wrote it paused and did not resume. A man copying from an original document would naturally lift his pen when he reached the edge of the paper. A man composing directly upon the page would reach the conclusion of his thought and stop there cleanly. I studied the 2 documents in silence. The detail was precisely as Holmes described. It was the kind of distinction that would have meant nothing to me without his direction, and everything once pointed out. "Then the confession was not composed at that desk," I said. "It was copied there, at some later point, by someone who wished to leave the impression that it had been." "And who either did not notice or did not consider," Holmes replied, returning to his chair, "that the act of copying would itself leave a trace inconsistent with the original composition." He produced from his coat pocket a small envelope, which he laid on the table between us. "There is a second matter, which I consider even more significant. You will recall that I noted during yesterday's visit the inkstand on Denning's desk. It was a double well stand of the common type, one well containing ink for general correspondence, the second containing a stronger, darker formulation of the kind often used for documents requiring permanence and clarity. I asked Mrs. Denning this morning whether her husband habitually used both wells, and she confirmed that he did, the darker ink being reserved specifically for formal papers and instruments of significance. He opened the envelope and tilted it gently over the table. Then 2 small slips of blotting paper slid out, each bearing a single smear of ink, one a warm brown black, and the other a deeper, bluer black. The first is from the general well as it stands today, Holmes said. The second I obtained by a careful examination of the dried ink on the confession document itself, which Pritchard was good enough to bring with him to Baker Street this morning for the purpose. He held them side by side. The difference was unmistakable, even to my untrained eye. Sir Malcolm Denning, composing a document of this personal gravity, would have reached without hesitation for the darker, formal ink. Instead, the confession is written in the ordinary correspondence ink, the kind a man uses when he sits at another person's desk and employs what is nearest to hand. The sitting room was very quiet for a moment. From below came the distant sound of a tradesman's cart moving slowly up Baker Street, the horse's hoofs deliberate on the damp cobblestones. "And Holmes," I said, "if the confession was not written by Denning, and if the evidence on the blotter was placed there to suggest that it was, then someone went to considerable trouble to construct a very particular impression. The question is not merely who wrote it, but when, and under what circumstances." Holmes's expression carried the controlled alertness I had come to associate with a case moving from its preliminary stages into something sharper and more dangerous. "Precisely, Watson. And there is one further detail, which I shall need another day to verify before I can speak to it with the confidence it deserves." He reached for his pipe and turned it in his hands without lighting it. "The pen used to write the confession. I know which one it was, and I know something about its ink that neither Lestrade nor Pritchard has thought, as yet, to ask." He rose and moved toward the window, and I understood that the morning's conclusions, significant as they were, had brought us only to the threshold of what the case truly contained. Chapter 5. Interviews in Shadow. There are cases in which Holmes moves at great speed, propelled by the urgency of events, or the imminent danger to some party whose safety depends upon his intervention. This was not such a case, and I remarked to myself as the days of that grey November week accumulated, that Holmes was conducting himself with a deliberateness that was itself a kind of strategy. He was, I gradually understood, allowing the principals in the affair to settle into whatever positions they had chosen for themselves, confident that a lie, held under the pressure of time and scrutiny, will eventually show its grain. On the Thursday, 2 days after his visit to the study and the morning's work with the blotter, Holmes announced over breakfast that he intended to call upon each of the 3 individuals associated with the Denning household in turn, independently and without the knowledge of the others. He invited me to accompany him, remarking that Watson's presence had a consistently humanizing effect on persons who might otherwise find his own manner somewhat austere. I accepted this compliment in the spirit in which it was offered. Our first call was upon Mrs. Eleanor Denning, and it differed from our initial interview in one significant respect. Holmes had arranged it through Pritchard in such a way that Mrs. Denning understood it to be a routine follow-up, a tidying of minor details rather than anything of investigative substance. The effect of this framing was immediately apparent. She received us in the same morning room as before, but with her guard lowered by a fraction, and it was in that fraction that the most useful material resided. She was composed as always, though there were signs beneath the surface of a week imperfectly slept. She spoke of her husband with a careful regard for accuracy that I found more moving, in its restrained way, than any open expression of grief might have been. It was when Holmes turned the conversation, with apparent casualness, toward the period immediately preceding Sir Malcolm's death that her composure underwent its first genuine test. "The anonymous letters," Holmes said, as though recalling a minor detail from a previous exchange. "You mentioned, I believe, that your husband had received correspondence of a disturbing nature in his final weeks." Mrs. Denning's hands, which had been resting with practised stillness in her lap, shifted almost imperceptibly. I mentioned that he had become withdrawn. I am not certain I used the word letters. "Forgive me," Holmes said, with a disarming inclination of his head. "Perhaps I inferred it from the general character of your description. Did he receive such letters?" A silence of several seconds. "He received something. He didn't show it to me, and I did not press him. There was an evening, perhaps a fortnight before his death, when he came in from the post with a letter that he put directly into the inside pocket of his coat, and his face had the look of a man who has been given news he has been half expecting and wholly dreading." She paused. "I asked him once whether anything was troubling him. He said only that there were matters he was endeavouring to put in their proper order, thus, and that he would speak to me when he had done so. He never had the opportunity." Holmes thanked her gently and moved on. He did not press further on the letters, and I understood why. He had obtained the confirmation he required, and any additional pressure would only have raised Mrs. Denning's alertness, without yielding proportionate return. As we descended the front steps and turned along the terrace, Holmes said, very quietly and without breaking his stride, "The letter, Watson. Not letters. One letter, placed immediately and with instinctive concealment into his coat pocket. A man who receives an anonymous communication of mere social unpleasantness does not conceal it from his wife as a reflex. He conceals what he recognises. Captain Hale received us at his rooms in Kensington, which told their own story. They were the rooms of a man who had once occupied a larger and more comfortable life, and had contracted gradually and without apparent resignation, turn into this reduced version of it. The furniture was good but worn, the books on the shelves those of a man who reads to fill time rather than from appetite, and the general atmosphere one of a bachelor existence maintained with soldierly tidiness, but without pleasure. He was calmer than at our previous meeting, though the wariness remained in his eyes throughout. When Holmes put it to him directly that Denning had been involved in a financial matter during their younger years, Hale neither denied it nor elaborated upon it with the eagerness of a man who has nothing to hide. He answered with the careful economy of someone who has decided in advance of the interview precisely how much of the truth he's prepared to surrender. "Malcolm made a mistake," he said at last, settling the matter with the finality of a man closing a door he does not intend to reopen. He was young, and he trusted someone who used that trust against him. When he understood what had been done, he made it right, at considerable personal cost. That is the entirety of the story that bears upon his honour. The rest is not mine to tell. Holmes regarded him steadily. The person who used that trust, was it someone whose family connections have extended into Denning's life in more recent years? Hale's expression did not change, but something behind it shifted, like a weight settling in a deep water. He said nothing for a long moment. Then, choosing each word with the precision of a man who understands that imprecision could harm someone other than himself, he replied, "I would strongly suggest, Mr. Holmes, that you look carefully at everything that has been placed before you in the course of this investigation, not only at what has been offered, but at what has been offered too readily." It was the most useful thing he had said in any of our interviews, and the most carefully constructed. Holmes thanked him without pressing further, and we descended to the street. Arthur Linton kept rooms above a stationer's shop in Bloomsbury, modest but neatly ordered in a manner consistent with everything we had observed of him. He greeted us with his customary cooperative efficiency, took our coats with a solicitude that was genuine rather than merely habitual, and offered tea with such practised hospitality that one almost forgot the circumstances of our call entirely. This, I was beginning to understand, was Linton's particular gift. The creation of an atmosphere so professionally agreeable that the natural sharpness of scrutiny was quietly blunted. Holmes accepted the tea and settled into the offered chair with an air of perfect comfort, as though this were a social occasion of no special significance. He asked Linton several questions of an administrative nature concerning Sir Malcolm's estate, the management of his correspondence, and the disposition of various appointments in the final days. Linton answered all of them with the same smooth, detailed fluency as before. Then Holmes said, in the same unhurried tone he had maintained throughout, "You joined Sir Malcolm's household 7 years ago. Your father had known him previously, I understand." Linton's response came without hesitation. "My father and Sir Malcolm moved in overlapping professional circles many years ago. The acquaintance was not a close one. My own employment with Sir Malcolm arose through a formal application to his solicitors and was conducted entirely on its own merits." "Of course," Holmes said pleasantly. "And your father? He is still living?" "He died 4 years ago." "I am sorry to hear it." Holmes set down his cup and rose with the unhurried ease of a man concluding a perfectly satisfactory visit. "One small matter before we go. In your account of discovering the confession in Sir Malcolm's desk, you mentioned that the document was folded once. Would you say it was folded in the manner of a letter prepared for an envelope, or simply folded flat upon itself?" Linton blinked, and for the first time in our acquaintance I saw him pause before answering. A pause of perhaps 2 seconds, which in the context of his habitual fluency was the equivalent of a much longer hesitation. "Folded flat," he said, "simply in half." "Thank you," Holmes said. "That is most helpful." In the cab returning to Baker Street, I turned the 3 interviews over in my mind and attempted to extract from them some coherent shape. The anonymous letter received by Denning, and concealed with the instinct of a man who recognised its author. Hale's careful warning to look at what had been offered too readily. And Linton's 2-second pause before describing the fold of the confession document. "Holmes," I said, "Hale's remark about examining what has been offered too readily." He was referring to Linton. Holmes was looking out of the window at the passing streets, his profile clean and still against the grey afternoon light. "Captain Hale," he said quietly, "is a man with very little left to lose and a strong residual sense of honour. He told us, Watson, as much as he believed he could tell us without making a direct accusation he cannot yet substantiate." A pause. "It is enough. It is, in fact, precisely enough." He said nothing further for the remainder of the journey, but there was about his silence the quality of a man who has found the last piece of an arrangement and is considering with calm satisfaction where precisely it belongs. Chapter 6. The Silent Reconstruction. It has been my experience in recording these cases for the benefit of a reading public that has shown a generosity of interest I have never felt entirely able to justify, that the chapters least suited to dramatic narration are frequently those of the greatest investigative significance. The hours Holmes devoted to what I came to think of as the silent reconstruction were passed almost entirely within the confines of our Baker Street sitting room, without visitors, without excursions, and without any of the external incident that gives a narrative its forward momentum. And yet it was during those hours, on the Friday and Saturday following our round of interviews, that the case was, in all the ways that mattered, resolved. I do not mean that Holmes identified the guilty party during that period, for he had, I suspect, arrived at a very firm, private conclusion rather sooner than he permitted himself to announce it. What he accomplished in those 2 days was the construction of an argument so complete and so logically continuous that not a single link in it could be challenged. Holmes was a man who distrusted the merely probable with an intensity that some found unreasonable, and he would not move against a person on the strength of inference alone, however compelling, when the means to establish certainty remained available to him. He cleared the central table on the Friday morning, removing papers and books with a systematic efficiency that left its surface entirely bare. From his room he brought several items, his own writing materials, a collection of papers of varying quality, and the bottle of dark formal ink he had obtained by some means I had not inquired into, which matched the secondary well in Denning's inkstand. He arranged these objects with the care of a man setting a stage, positioning them in relation to one another in a configuration I gradually recognised as a reconstruction of Denning's writing desk, as he had observed it on our initial visit. I watched from my armchair with a curious mixture of bewilderment and trust that Holmes's working methods habitually produced in me. He sat down at the table, adjusted the position of the paper before him, and wrote for several minutes in a hand that was not his own, I recognised, with a start, that he was reproducing the text of the Unsigned Confession from memory, or rather from the careful transcription he had made during Pritchard's earlier visit. When he had finished, he lifted the page and examined it, then set it down and wrote it again. He did this 4 times in total, each iteration producing a subtly different result. The variations in pressure and pace deliberately introduced, as I understood, to model the range of hands that might have produced the document as it existed. On the final occasion he wrote more slowly, with a rigid evenness of pressure that I now associated with his earlier description of copying, also compared the result with the graphite impression from the blotter. He said nothing throughout this procedure, and I did not disturb him. The afternoon light moved across the table as the hours passed, and the fire burned down and was replenished, and Holmes worked with the quiet absorption of a craftsman, engaged in a technical problem that required patience rather than inspiration. It was at 4:30, as the last of the daylight was failing, and Mrs. Hudson had brought in the lamp, that he finally sat back and regarded the document spread before him with an expression of settled satisfaction. "Come and look at this, Watson," he said. I crossed to the table and stood beside him. He had arranged 4 sheets in a row, each bearing a version of the confession text, with the blotter impression laid alongside for comparison. "These first 2, he said, indicating them, represent the natural variation you would expect from genuine original composition. The pressure is irregular. The letter formations show the small inconsistencies of a hand expressing thought as it writes. These latter 2 represent copying, the pressure uniform, the letter form slightly more deliberate, as though the hand is following rather than leading." He moved his finger to the blotter impression. The document on that blotter corresponds to the latter category, unambiguously, which establishes that someone copied the confession onto Denning's writing surface, I said. Which establishes that someone sat at Denning's desk after his death, with the confession document before them, and copied a substantial portion of its text directly onto the desk surface, presumably onto a sheet of paper placed above the blotter, with the deliberate intention of embedding an impression that would suggest the confession had been composed there. He paused. The irony being that a genuinely composed document would not have left so clean and uniform an impression. The very neatness of the deception reveals it. He gathered the sheets together and set them aside, then produced from the drawer beside him a small glass vial containing, as he explained, a quantity of ink he had drawn from the pen tray on Denning's desk, specifically from the fountain pen found in the tray, which Linton had stated was Denning's habitual writing instrument. Beside it he placed the 2 blotting paper slips he had shown me 2 days previously, the one bearing the ordinary correspondence ink, the other the ink from the confession document itself. "I sent a sample to a consulting chemist I have used on previous occasions," Holmes said. "His analysis arrived this morning." He indicated a brief typed letter lying at the edge of the table. The ink in Denning's fountain pen at the time of our visit, and the ink used to write the Unsigned Confession, are not the same formulation. The pen had been refilled after the confession was written, with the ordinary correspondence ink from the general well. Someone used the pen to write the document, then refilled it, presumably to obscure the fact that it had been used with the other ink. I absorbed this. Then the sequence is as follows. The confession was written using Denning's pen, but filled with the wrong ink. The pen was then refilled with the correct ink to conceal the discrepancy. The text was copied onto the desk surface to suggest prior composition, and the document was placed in the locked drawer to be discovered. All of which was accomplished, Holmes said, between the death of Sir Malcolm Denning and the arrival of the morning light, during which period the study was, according to Lestrade's account, unguarded. He rose from the table and moved to stand before the fireplace, one hand resting on the mantelpiece and his gaze directed into the middle distance with the stillness of final consideration. "Now, attend to the matter of the fold," he said. "Linton told us the confession was folded simply in half. A document written by a man for his own private purposes and then locked away in his own desk is not folded. It is laid flat or at most rolled in the manner of papers that have been read and set aside. A document folded in half is a document that has been transported, carried in a coat pocket perhaps, or in a document case. It was folded before it was placed in that drawer, Watson, because it arrived there from elsewhere. The fire crackled softly. Outside, a cab passed along Baker Street at a trot, its lamp throwing a brief warm arc across the ceiling. He made one further error, Holmes said, and his tone had taken on the quality it always carried at the point where the architecture of a case became fully visible to him. Not triumphant precisely, but carrying a kind of quiet weight, as though the truth, having been located, carried with it the natural gravity of all things that are real. In his account of discovering the document, Linton told us that it was found beneath a bundle of older correspondence. If a man locks a private confession in a drawer among his other papers, he places it where it belongs in the sequence of his documents. He does not place it beneath older material, because older material was there first. A document placed beneath the existing contents of a drawer was placed there by someone other than the drawer's owner. Someone who opened the drawer, deposited the document, and covered it with whatever lay to hand. I straightened and looked at him. You have been certain since the interviews. Holmes turned from the fireplace, and for a moment something moved briefly in his expression, a quality not quite of sadness but of its near neighbour, the feeling a man might have on confirming a conclusion he had hoped, on some secondary level, to have been wrong about. Since, rather before the interviews, he said quietly. But certainty and proof are not the same instrument, and I will not use the former in place of the latter. He moved to his chair and sat, reaching for his pipe with the air of a man drawing a day's work to its proper conclusion. Tomorrow I shall speak to Lestrade. There is one further inquiry I require him to make, concerning the history of Linton's father and his connection to Denning's old business affairs. When that is done, I believe we shall be ready. He said nothing more, and I returned to my own chair and sat for a time in the companionable quiet of the room, listening to the fire and thinking about the distance between a man's guilt and its demonstration, and about the patience that the second required of those who pursued it. Chapter 7. Lestrade's Triumph. Lestrade arrived on the Saturday morning in a condition that I can only describe as quietly jubilant, which in his case manifested not as any outward effusiveness, but as a particular set to the shoulders and a briskness of movement that suggested a man who has slept well, because events have arranged themselves to his satisfaction. He accepted Mrs. Hudson's offer of coffee, settled himself in the basket chair with his notebook already open, and directed at Holmes the look of a man who anticipates, with some pleasure, the reversal of their usual respective positions. I had the impression, not for the first time, that Lestrade's relationship with Holmes was considerably more complicated than it appeared on the surface. He was not a stupid man, and he understood perfectly well that Holmes regularly perceived what he had missed, which was a knowledge that sat in him with varying degrees of comfort depending upon the circumstances. When he believed himself ahead of Holmes, as he evidently did this morning, there was a generosity in his manner that spoke well of him. He was not a man who held grudges against superior intelligence, only against superior condescension, and Holmes, to do him justice, reserved the latter for moments when lives rather than careers were at stake. "I have a witness," Lestrade said, with the measured pride of a man placing a trump card on the table with deliberate care. "A reliable one, a retired coachman by the name of Fenton, who lives 2 doors from the Denning house and whose habit it is to sit at his front window of an evening, on account of a leg that troubles him in the cold and prevents him sleeping. He saw Captain Hale arrive at the Denning house at 20 minutes past 9 on the night of Sir Malcolm's death. He's certain of both the identity and the time. He knows Hale by sight from previous visits. And he had reason to note the hour because he had been listening for the church clock. Holmes received this information with an expression of polite attention that gave nothing away. At what hour did Hale leave? Fenton did not see him leave. He retired from his window at around 9:30, when the cold became too much for his leg. So your witness places Hale at the door of the Denning house at 9:20, Holmes said, which is consistent with the established time of Sir Malcolm's collapse, and confirms that Hale was in the vicinity. It does not place him inside the house, and it does not account for his movements after 9:30. It establishes presence and opportunity, Lestrade said, with the firmness of a man who knows the distinction Holmes is drawing and has anticipated it. Combined with motive and the pattern of his behaviour throughout this investigation, I consider it sufficient to bring him in for formal questioning. His continued refusal to account for his movements that evening has not helped his position. Holmes rose and moved to the window in that way he had, not from restlessness, but to place himself at an angle to the conversation that allowed him to think without appearing to withhold. "Before you proceed with Hale," he said, with his back still partially turned, "I should like you to undertake a single inquiry on my behalf. It will require access to certain financial and commercial records that your official position can obtain more readily than I can." Lestrade's expression shifted very slightly toward the wary. "What records?" "The business affairs of a man named Linton, who was a commercial agent operating in the city approximately 20 years ago. Specifically, I should like to know whether his name appears in connection with any investigation or legal proceeding arising from a fraudulent transaction conducted in partnership with, or at the expense of, parties including Sir Malcolm Denning." The inspector looked at him for a moment, and I watched him weigh the request against the confidence of his own position. "Linton is the secretary," he said. The helpful one. The very same. You think the secretary is involved?" Holmes turned from the window. "I think," he said carefully, "that your witness places Hale at the door of the Denning house at 9:20. I think it is possible that Hale was there. I think it is also possible that Hale, having been in the vicinity, was observed by another party, and that this observation has since proved useful to someone whose interest lies in directing attention toward Hale rather than elsewhere." He paused. "I'm not asking you to abandon your inquiry. I'm asking you to conduct one additional line of investigation before you commit your conclusion. The records I have mentioned will take you no more than a day to obtain." Lestrade considered this for several seconds with the honest deliberation of a man who is not entirely certain, and is making the effort to acknowledge it. "I'll look into it," he said at last. "I make no promises about the direction of the investigation. Hale's behaviour warrants formal attention, and I intend to give it to him. But I'll look into the Linton family business." After he had gone, Holmes returned to his chair and sat for a time without speaking. I had the sensation of a mechanism that had been carefully wound now beginning its forward movement, each part engaging the next in the sequence for which it had been designed. "The witness troubles you," I said. Holmes looked across at me. "The witness does not trouble me. The witness is very probably telling the truth. Fenton saw Hale arrive at the house at 9:20, and I have no reason to doubt his reliability on that specific point." He reached for his pipe. "What interests me rather more is the question of how it came to the attention of the police that Fenton existed and had something to report. A retired coachman sitting at his private window is not the kind of witness who presents himself spontaneously. Someone in that street, or with knowledge of that street, was aware of Fenton's habit and directed inquiry toward him." I turned this over. "You think Fenton was pointed out to the police?" "I think it is a reasonable hypothesis. The convenience of a witness who confirms Hale's presence without being in a position to observe anything further is rather too neat." He lit the pipe and drew on it reflectively. "However, it is not necessary for my purposes to prove it. What is necessary is that Lestrade examine the Linton records and find what I am confident they contain." The remainder of the day passed quietly. Holmes read. He made a number of entries in the index volumes he kept on the shelf above his desk, and on 2 occasions stood at the window for extended periods that had nothing to do with observation and everything to do with thought. I occupied myself with a medical article I had been commissioned to write, and found that the work went well, as it often does when there is some separate preoccupation gently exercising the back of one's mind. Lestrade's message arrived the following afternoon, a Sunday, which spoke to the seriousness with which he had taken Holmes's request. It was written in his customary terse hand and ran to no more than 4 lines, but Holmes read it twice, set it on the mantelpiece, and permitted himself an expression of the most restrained possible satisfaction. He handed the note to me without comment. It confirmed that one Edmund Linton, commercial agent, had been named in a civil proceeding some 18 years previously in connection with an alleged misappropriation of funds belonging to a partnership in which Sir Malcolm Denning had been a junior investor. The proceeding had been settled privately, without trial, and the records had consequently remained obscure. Edmund Linton had died 4 years earlier, survived by one son, Arthur. I set the note down and looked at Holmes. Then the motive is exactly as you supposed. Arthur Linton knew his father had been responsible for the old fraud. He knew that Denning had covered it for whatever reason, and that the truth of it still existed in documents or memory available to Denning. And feared, Holmes said from across the room, that Denning had decided in the shadow of his own declining health that the time had come to put the record straight. A man who knows he is dying and has an old injustice on his conscience is a man whose behaviour becomes, and to those with reason to fear his disclosure, unpredictable. He rose and moved to the desk. The anonymous letter Mrs. Denning described was almost certainly a last attempt to discourage that disclosure. When it failed, or when Linton believed it had failed, the confrontation occurred. And after Denning died, I said, following the sequence through, Linton found himself in possession of a considerable problem. This was whatever documents or correspondence Denning had assembled with a view to disclosure were now lying in that study, accessible to anyone who examined the papers. His solution was to provide a different explanation for their existence and for the entire shape of events before anyone else could establish the true one. Precisely, Holmes took up his pen. He required something that would confirm Denning's guilt rather than his own father's, and that would simultaneously provide a motive for Hale, whose presence in Denning's life and known association with the old financial affair made him a plausible alternative focus for any inquiry. The pen moved across the paper with quiet purpose. The Unsigned Confession served both requirements admirably. It named no specific author, and its lack of signature, which he may have congratulated himself upon as an additional subtlety, was in fact the single feature most likely to attract the attention of someone with the habit of looking at what is absent rather than what is present. He set down the pen and looked across the sitting room with an expression that carried no pleasure in the conclusion, only the steady, clear-eyed certainty of a mind that has completed its work. "We shall go to Pritchard tomorrow morning," he said, "and from there, I think, we shall require Lestrade again." Outside on Baker Street, a light rain had begun, tapping without urgency against the window glass, and the gas lamps wore their customary halos in the damp air. It was an ordinary London Sunday, and somewhere across the city Arthur Linton was, I supposed, spending it in the reasonable belief that his arrangement had held. He would not hold that belief much longer. Chapter 8. The Detail No One Saw. We called upon Pritchard at his Gray's Inn Road offices on the Monday morning, and found him in the condition of a man who has been carrying an uncomfortable weight for rather longer than his constitution was designed to bear. He rose when we entered, with a relieved alacrity that was almost painful to observe, and I was reminded that solicitors, for all the professional composure their training produces, are not immune to the particular anxiety of a case that has grown beyond its original dimensions. Holmes wasted very little time on preliminary civilities, and he laid before Pritchard, in the systematic sequence he had developed over the weekend, the substance of what his inquiries had established, the blotter evidence and its implication of copying rather than composition, the ink discrepancy and its bearing on the pen, the fold in the document and what it indicated about the manner of its deposition, and finally the civil proceeding against Edmund Linton and its connection to Denning's history. He presented these points without dramatic emphasis, in the measured tone of a man delivering a technical report, and I watched Pritchard's expression move through several distinct phases of response, from surprise to unease to a kind of reluctant, sobered understanding. "You are telling me," Pritchard said when Holmes had finished, "that the document I brought to you as evidence of Sir Malcolm's guilt is itself the primary instrument of the crime." "I am telling you that it was constructed with that purpose," Holmes replied. "Whether the law will ultimately characterize it as the instrument of a crime depends upon what Lestrade's formal inquiry produces. and upon certain additional facts that I intend to establish today. What I can tell you with confidence is that Sir Malcolm Denning did not write that confession, that it was written after his death, and that the person who wrote it had access to his study, his pen, and his private papers during the hours between his collapse and the following morning. Pritchard was silent for a moment, his fingers moving without conscious direction across the surface of a document on his desk. Arthur Linton had access to all of those things. Mrs. Denning gave him leave the morning after the death to attend to certain correspondence on behalf of the estate. He was in that study for the better part of 2 hours. The morning after, Holmes said. Not during the night. No, Pritchard paused, though I cannot speak to his movements during the night itself. Holmes inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the distinction as one he had already noted. He asked Pritchard to make available to him, on behalf of the estate, the original confession document and the fountain pen from Denning's desk, both of which Pritchard held in his custody pending the outcome of the police inquiry. Saw as Pritchard unlocked the small iron safe in the corner of his office and produced a wooden box, inside which the 2 items rested in the careful arrangement of a man who understands the importance of preserving evidence in the condition in which it was found. Holmes took the pen first. It was a good quality instrument, a Conway Stewart of the substantial kind, preferred by a man who writes at length and values reliability over elegance, Rahor, with a barrel of dark green mottled celluloid and a broad gold nib. He uncapped it, held the nib to the light, then drew a line on a piece of paper from Pritchard's desk. The ink that emerged was the warm correspondence black I had seen on the blotter sample slips. He recapped the pen and set it aside. He then took up the confession document and examined it with his lens, moving methodically from the upper margin to the lower, often pausing at several points with the still concentration of a man reading a secondary text laid beneath the primary one. I watched his face rather than the paper, as I had learned long ago was the more instructive object of observation, and I saw at one point a very slight tightening about the eyes that in Holmes indicated not new discovery but confirmation of something already suspected. He set the document down and looked at Pritchard. "When Linton delivered this document to you, how did he carry it?" Pritchard considered. "In his hand. He had unfolded it, I think, before he brought it into the room. He placed it on my desk and stood back while I read it." "He had unfolded it," Holmes repeated, "so that you received it as an open, flat document, and the fold I've been discussing was present only before it reached you." "That is correct." "Did he handle it by its edges, or more generally?" Pritchard looked uncertain. "I could not say with any precision. He held it at the lower right corner, as I recall, while I was reading it." Holmes nodded once, with the finality of a man setting down the last stone in a careful construction. He thanked Pritchard, asked him to preserve both items without further handling, and informed him that he expected the matter to reach its conclusion within 24 hours, after which the solicitor's responsibilities in the affair would become considerably more straightforward. We were back in Baker Street by 11:30, and Holmes spent the first quarter of an hour after our return entirely motionless in his armchair, with the tips of his fingers pressed together and his eyes directed at the ceiling with an intensity of focus that discouraged any conversational overture. I occupied myself at my own desk and waited. When he spoke, yet it was with an abruptness that suggested he had arrived at the end of a particular line of reasoning and wished to communicate the result before pursuing the next. "The pen was refilled," he said, without preamble or apparent context. "We established that several days ago," I said carefully. "We established that it had been refilled. We did not fully consider by whom, and under what circumstances." He lowered his gaze from the ceiling and looked across at me directly. "Linton told us, in our first interview, that he had refilled Denning's pen on the morning of his employer's final day. He offered this information without being asked, as part of his account of his ordinary duties, and it registered at the time as an unremarkable domestic detail, the faithful secretary attending to his employer's desk." I saw where he was leading. But if Linton refilled the pen that morning, then the pen would have contained fresh ink for the remainder of that day and into the evening. And if the confession was written using the pen during the night, After Denning's death, the ink used would have been whatever ink Linton put in during his morning refill. Precisely. And the ink Linton put in during his morning refill was, by his own account, the ordinary correspondence ink drawn from the general well, because that was his habitual practice. Holmes rose and moved to the mantelpiece where Lestrade's Sunday message still lay. But the confession is written in a formulation that does not match the correspondence ink. It matches neither well in the inkstand. He turned. Because it was not written with ink from Denning's inkstand at all. It was written with ink that Linton brought with him. I sat back in my chair and absorbed the full weight of this. He came prepared, I said. He did not compose the confession opportunistically, using whatever was to hand. He arrived at the house that night with the document in his pocket and his own ink, having planned the entire arrangement in advance. And made one error of a kind that is almost always made by very careful people, Holmes said. The error of the man who has thought through the large architecture of his deception, without attending sufficiently to the small material facts. He knew that Denning's pen should appear to have written the document. He knew he must use the pen. He did not know, or did not consider, that the ink already in the pen after his own morning refill would not match the ink he had brought with him, and that refilling the pen afterward, to cover the discrepancy, would itself leave a detectable trace. He picked up Lestrade's note and set it down again. Lestrade will arrive this morning. I sent him a message before we left for Pritchard's. He should be here within the hour. Lestrade arrived at 12:05, in a mood somewhat less triumphant than his Saturday visit, the Linton records having evidently given him something to reconsider. He listened to Holmes's account of the ink evidence with the careful attention of a man who's been wrong before, and takes a professional pride in not compounding the error, and when Holmes had concluded he was quiet for a moment before speaking. You can demonstrate all of this, he said. Not a challenge precisely, but a request for practical assurance. The chemist's analysis establishes the ink discrepancy beyond reasonable dispute, Holmes replied. The blotter evidence is visually demonstrable and will survive examination by any competent analyst. The civil records you have obtained establish the motive and the connection, and the testimony of Linton himself in our first interview provides the detail about the morning refill that makes the ink evidence conclusive. He paused. There is one further thing I should like to establish before you proceed, which is whether Linton was in the vicinity of the Denning house during the night of Sir Malcolm's death. Your witness Fenton may be able to assist with that, if he is asked the right question. Lestrade's eyes sharpened. You think Fenton saw Linton as well? I think Fenton was asked whether he saw Hale, and answered the question he was asked. Whether he saw anyone else that evening has not, so far as I am aware, been established. I would suggest asking him. Lestrade rose and closed his notebook with the decisive snap of a man who has redirected his energies and is content with the new direction. I'll speak to Fenton this afternoon, he said, and I'll want a full written account of the ink analysis for the purposes of any proceeding. You shall have it, Holmes said. When the inspector had gone, I poured us each a glass of the whisky Mrs. Hudson had placed on the side table, and carried Holmes's across to him at the fireplace. He accepted it without comment, and we stood for a moment in the quiet of the sitting room, the city conducting its business beyond the windows with the cheerful indifference to private drama that London has always maintained. One further detail, I said, because the thought had been forming through the latter part of the morning and had now resolved itself fully. The unsigned nature of the confession. You said at the outset that it was the single most significant feature. You did not mean that Linton omitted the signature from carelessness. Holmes turned his glass in his hand. He omitted it with calculation. A signed confession would have directed inquiry toward Denning's history and his associates with such specificity that the entire affair would have been resolved quickly and the fabrication exposed just as quickly. An unsigned confession invited speculation, distributed suspicion, and above all gave Lestrade something convenient to attach to Hale, without any single element being sufficiently definitive to invite close scrutiny. He paused. What Linton did not foresee is that the absence of a signature is itself an invitation to a particular kind of mind. A signature, once provided, closes a document. The absence of one opens it. He raised his glass briefly, in a gesture that was not quite a toast, and looked into the fire. "Tomorrow," he said. "We shall close it properly." Chapter 9. The Truth Revealed. Lestrade's message reached Baker Street at 8:30 on the Tuesday morning, before Holmes and I had properly finished breakfast. Holmes read it standing at the mantelpiece in his dressing gown, set it down and returned to his chair and his toast, with the composure of a man receiving confirmation of a train timetable he had already memorised. He handed the note across to me without comment. Fenton, the retired coachman, when asked whether he had observed anyone else at or near the Denning house on the night in question, had recalled, after some prompting, that a younger man carrying a document case had passed along the terrace shortly before 9 o'clock and had paused at the Denning gate for long enough to be admitted by someone within. Fenton had not mentioned this because he had not been asked about it, and because the younger man's presence had struck him as unremarkable at the time, and consistent with the sort of professional visit a household of that standing might receive at any hour. He had identified Arthur Linton from a description, though not from a photograph, and the identification was consequently provisional. Lestrade had added a single line at the foot of the note in handwriting somewhat more pressured than his customary style, which I interpreted as the mark of a man exercising considerable restraint. It read, "I shall be at the Denning house at 11. I trust you will join me." "He's not entirely pleased," I remarked. "Lestrade is a professional," Holmes said, reaching for the marmalade with equanimity. "His displeasure is a private matter. In his professional capacity he will conduct himself with complete correctness, which is all that is required of him, and rather more than is required of some." We arrived at the Mayfair house at 5 minutes before the hour. The morning was clear and cold, the fog that had characterised the earlier days of the affair having retreated at last to leave a pale winter sky above the rooftops, and the terrace presented itself in sharp outline, the geometry of its railings and steps precisely drawn against the light. Lestrade was already at the door, accompanied by a constable whose youth and solemnity suggested he understood that the occasion was significant without yet knowing why. Pritchard was present, having been summoned by Holmes the previous evening, and Mrs. Denning had been informed. She stood in the morning room when we entered, dressed in black as before, but with a quality in her bearing that I had not observed in our earlier meetings, a kind of alert readiness, as though she'd slept badly not from distress but from the anticipation of something long deferred finally approaching resolution. Arthur Linton arrived 4 minutes after us. He had been asked by Pritchard to attend on the grounds that certain administrative matters relating to the estate required his clarification, and he came in carrying his document case with the habitual efficiency of a man presenting himself for an ordinary professional morning. He took in the assembled company with a single rapid assessment, and I watched the adjustment cross his face, swift and controlled, from professional readiness to something more careful. He chose a chair near the window and sat with the document case across his knees, and his expression settled into the cooperative attentiveness that had characterised all of our previous interactions. It was a remarkable performance, and I found myself, not for the first time in my association with Holmes, reflecting upon the extraordinary human capacity to sustain composure in conditions where composure must have cost almost everything. Holmes stood near the centre of the room, and not at its front as though addressing an audience, but positioned with the easy naturalness of a man in conversation, and he began without any formal introduction. "Mr. Linton," he said, "I should like to take you through the events of the evening of Sir Malcolm's death, not as they have been reconstructed by the police inquiry, but as they actually occurred. I shall ask you to correct me if I am wrong at any point, and I shall ask you to attend to the specific details rather than the general shape of what I describe, because it is in the specific details that the substance of this matter resides." Linton nodded once, with the air of a man agreeing to terms he considers reasonable. "You arrived at this house shortly before 9 o'clock on the evening in question," Holmes said. "You were admitted, I believe, by Graves, the butler, who will confirm the visit if asked. The purpose you gave for your arrival was in keeping with your regular duties a document requiring Sir Malcolm's attention, or some similar professional pretext, you were shown to the study. Linton's expression did not change. He said nothing, which was itself a choice of a particular kind. What occurred in the study was not, I think, what you had planned, Holmes continued, and his tone shifted very slightly, losing nothing of its precision but acquiring, beneath it, a quality that I can only describe as the acknowledgement of a human weight. You had come, I believe, to confront Sir Malcolm with what you had discovered about your father's connection to the financial affair of 20 years ago, and with your knowledge that Denning intended to set the record of that affair straight before his health failed entirely. You had written to him anonymously, warning him against disclosure. He had not been deterred, and so you came yourself. Mrs. Denning, who had been standing near the fireplace with her hands folded before her, closed her eyes briefly and then opened them again and remained still. The confrontation was not, in the ordinary sense, violent, Holmes said. You did not harm Sir Malcolm in any direct physical manner, but the nature of what you said to him, the threat of what you were prepared to do to protect your father's memory and your own position, was sufficient to precipitate exactly the cardiac event his physician had for months been warning him against. He collapsed. He died. And you were left standing in this room with the full consequences of what had occurred settling around you. Linton's hands on the document case had tightened, a degree of pressure sufficient to whiten the knuckles at their joints, but his face remained composed. What happened next required a quality of mind that I will acknowledge, without admiration, was considerable, Holmes said. You understood, in the immediate aftermath of Sir Malcolm's collapse, that the study contained documents which, if examined, would establish the truth of your father's actions and Denning's knowledge of them, and that your own visit that evening, once known, would connect you to the circumstances of the death. You required an alternative explanation, one sufficiently plausible to satisfy a police inquiry, and sufficiently specific to direct suspicion elsewhere. See, had I imagined some time in which to think before Graves returned or Mrs. Denning was informed. He paused, and in the silence of the room the sound of the street outside seemed very distant. You had come with the means to produce that alternative explanation already in your possession. The confession document which you had composed earlier and carried with you in your document case folded once, and the separate ink with which it had been written, formulated to suggest the weight of formal disclosure without matching any ink available in this house. You used Sir Malcolm's pen because the pen was there and its use would implicate him. You pressed firmly enough on the writing surface to leave impressions on the blotter because you understood that such impressions would be taken as evidence of original composition, and you placed the document in the locked drawer and covered it with older papers, because a document placed there by its author would occupy the position most recently arrived at, not the oldest. Linton's breathing had changed, become somewhat more deliberate in its pace, the controlled respiration of a man managing a physical response. But he had not spoken. He had not, I realised, spoken a single word since his arrival. You made 3 errors, Holmes said, and now his voice was entirely level, carrying no judgment beyond the statement of fact. The blotter impressions were too uniform for original composition. The ink on the confession matched neither well in the inkstand, and the morning refill of the pen, which you performed yourself, and mentioned in our first interview with a casualness that was precisely calibrated, meant that whatever ink the pen contained when you used it that evening could not have been the ink found on the document. The pen had been refilled by you with correspondence ink before the confession was written. The confession carries different ink. You brought it with you. The room was very quiet. Mrs. Denning had turned slightly toward the window. Lestrade stood with his notebook open and his pencil held, not moving. Arthur Linton looked down at the document case in his lap for a moment. When he raised his head, his expression had undergone a change that was neither dramatic nor sudden, but was absolute, as complete as the alteration in light when a cloud crosses the sun. The cooperative attentiveness was gone, and what replaced it was something exhausted and unguarded, the face of a man who's been holding a very great weight for a very long time, and has at last set it down. He was going to ruin my father's name, he said, His voice was quiet and entirely steady. "My father has been dead 4 years. He cannot defend himself. Whatever he did, it was 20 years ago, and he spent the remainder of his life as an honest man." A pause. "I did not intend Sir Malcolm to die. I want that to be understood. I came to dissuade him, not to harm him." "I believe you," Holmes said. Lestrade stepped forward then, with the quiet efficiency of a man resuming a function that had been briefly held in suspension, and the professional mechanism of the law engaged itself with the dignified inevitability that it always carries in such moments. I remained where I was, beside the door, and watched Arthur Linton rise and accompany the inspector from the room, with his document case still held in one hand, and his bearing still, even now, composed. There are men who have no other resource in adversity but their own self-possession, and Linton was one of them. I could not find it in me to think well of what he had done, but I found, as I watched him go, that I understood it, which is perhaps the closest the dispassionate observer can come to mercy. Holmes had moved to the window and stood looking out at the sharp November morning, his hands in his pockets and his profile very still. Mrs. Denning remained by the fireplace. After a moment she said, in a voice that carried no particular emotion, but only the plainness of a thing that must be acknowledged, "My husband wished to tell the truth. That was all. He simply wished, before he died, to tell the truth." Holmes turned from the window. "He did tell it," he said, "in the only way that remained available to him. He told it by the absence of his signature on a document that was not his." Mrs. Denning considered this for a long moment, and then inclined her head, with the small, precise gesture of a woman accepting something that is not comfort but is, in its way, sufficient. Pritchard, in the corner, began quietly assembling his papers. Chapter 10. Watson's Reflection. It is one of the habits of a medical man, formed through years of attendance at bedsides and the management of difficult news, to find his thoughts dwelling not upon the dramatic climax of an event, but upon its aftermath, upon the quieter hours that follow resolution, and carry their own particular weight. The day after Arthur Linton's arrest, I rose early, breakfasted alone, and sat for some time with my notebook open before me, and my pen uncapped, finding the first sentence of my account considerably harder to begin than any that followed it. There is always a moment in setting down these cases when the sheer human complexity of what has occurred resists the orderly progression of narrative, and this was more than usually such a case. Holmes did not come down until nearly 10 o'clock, which was itself a sign of the particular quality of the preceding days. When he is engaged upon a case that demands sustained concentration of the close, precise variety this one had required, the release of that concentration on its conclusion produces in him not the immediate restlessness that follows his periods of enforced idleness, but a temporary quietness, a kind of convalescence of the intellect. He came in, surveyed the breakfast things with the mild surprise of a man returning from a considerable distance, and poured himself coffee with the unhurried movements of someone reclaiming ordinary domestic time. "You're writing it up," he observed, glancing at my notebook. "I am attempting to," I said. He sat and looked for a moment at the grey morning beyond the window. The fog had not returned, and Baker Street presented itself in the clean, unambiguous lines of a cold, late November day. The pavement traffic moving with purposeful briskness, and the bare branches of the plane tree at the corner drawn against the sky in ink. "Begin with the fog," Holmes said, and reached for his pipe. I had intended, in the manner of these reflections, to set down a number of things that had accumulated through the course of the week, and had not found their proper place in the sequence of events as I recorded them. The case had been, in certain respects, unlike the majority of those I have had occasion to chronicle. There had been no moment of acute physical danger, no pursuit, no confrontation in which bodily courage was required of either of us. The entire investigation had been conducted in drawing rooms and offices in the quiet of Baker Street, and its instruments had been graphite and blotting paper and a small glass phial of ink. And yet I had found it, on reflection, one of the more unsettling cases in my experience. Because the wrong it addressed was of the kind that leaves no clean wound, only a diffuse and lasting damage to the reputations and hearts of people who had none of them acted with uncomplicated innocence or uncomplicated guilt. Lestrade called that afternoon in a mood that had settled from its earlier displaced energies into something closer to his baseline professional equanimity. He accepted a whisky with more readiness than was strictly his custom, and sat for a while in the basket chair with a glass resting on his knee, talking about the case with the reflective quality of a man reviewing a completed action and determining what he might carry forward from it. "He'll face a charge arising from the fabrication of evidence," Lestrade said. "Whether anything more can be established in connection with the death itself will depend upon the medical evidence and what the coroner's review produces. The confrontation is not in dispute. Whether the law will find it sufficient to support a graver charge is another matter." "The law will find what the facts support," Holmes said from his armchair. "No more and no less. That is its function and its limitations simultaneously." Lestrade gave him a look that contained, in equal measure, agreement and mild exasperation. "You'll testify to the ink analysis and the blotter evidence, when required. And the matter of the pen refill, that's the hinge of the whole thing, as I understand it." "The hinge," Holmes agreed, "though not the foundation. The foundation is the fold in the document, the position of the confession beneath the older papers in the drawer, and the uniformity of the blotter impression. Any one of those three observations, taken alone, might be challenged or explained. Taken together, they admit of only one construction." Lestrade finished his whisky and rose with the purposeful air of a man returning to an unfinished landscape. At the door he paused and turned back, and for a moment his expression carried a candour that was absent from his usual dealings with Holmes, the candour of a professional man acknowledging in private what he would not easily acknowledge in public. "Fenton," he said. "The business of directing the inquiry toward Fenton. I asked him, as you suggested, how it came to his attention that the police might be interested in what he had seen. He said a young man had knocked at his door 2 days after the death, and asked him, in a general way, whether he had noticed anything unusual in the street on the night in question. He described the man who called on him, and the description is consistent with Linton." A brief pause. "I ought to have asked that question myself." From the beginning. Holmes said nothing, which was, in the circumstances, the most generous response available to him. After Lestrade had gone, the sitting room settled back into its habitual quiet, and I returned to my notebook and wrote for some time without difficulty, the words coming with the particular ease that follows a period of obstruction. Holmes read and played a little, and once or twice made annotations in one of the indexed volumes on his shelf in the small, precise hand he used for records he intended to preserve. It was toward evening, as the light faded over Baker Street, and Mrs. Hudson's footsteps on the stairs announced the approach of the supper tray, that Holmes set down his book and spoke in the reflective tone he occasionally adopted at the conclusion of a case, when the distance between himself and its events had grown sufficient for him to regard it as a whole. "Captain Hale," he said. I looked up from my notes. "What of him?" "He behaved throughout this affair with a stubborn and somewhat belligerent species of honour that I find, on reflection, entirely consistent with his character as I read it in our first meeting. He refused to account for his movements on the night of Denning's death because he was present in that street, and did not wish to complicate an investigation he could not yet understand. He had gone, I believe, to speak to Denning himself, yea, for reasons not entirely dissimilar from Linton's, though his intentions were rather more protective than threatening. He found the house in commotion, understood that something serious had occurred, and withdrew without making his presence known. His silence since then has been that of a man who knows his presence would be misconstrued, and who lacks the particular kind of social facility required to explain an innocent appearance convincingly. You intend to speak to him?" "I've already written to him," Holmes said. "He will know by now that the matter has been resolved and that his own position is clear. He's not a man who will require reassurance, but he may appreciate the information." The supper tray arrived, and we ate by lamplight with the comfortable informality that was among the things I valued most in our domestic arrangement. The conversation moving without pressure through subjects both connected and unconnected to the case, and gradually becoming, as the evening settled around us, simply the conversation of two men who have spent a concentrated period in one another's company and have arrived, through the particular intimacy of shared inquiry, at something that requires no name. I had one further question, which had been forming since the conclusion of the previous day's proceedings, and I put it when the supper things had been cleared and Holmes had returned to his chair with his pipe. "The confession itself," I said. "What will become of it?" "It will be retained as evidence for the purposes of any proceeding," Holmes said. "After that it will presumably be disposed of by Pritchard, in accordance with whatever instructions the estate provides. And Sir Malcolm's original intention to set the record straight regarding the old fraud, will that ever be addressed?" Holmes drew on his pipe and looked for a moment at the ceiling. "The civil records Lestrade obtained are now in the possession of the police. They will become part of the documentation of this case. Whether that constitutes the form of disclosure Denning intended is a philosophical question rather than a legal one." A pause. "I think it may be sufficient. The truth has a way of occupying whatever space is made available to it." I wrote that down, as I have written down many of Holmes's observations over the years, not from a habit of uncritical record, but because some formulations once heard resist being lost. The truth has a way of occupying whatever space is made available to it. I've found, in the years since that November, that the observation extends considerably beyond the circumstances that produced it. Outside, the city moved through its evening with the vast unreflective energy it has always possessed, its thousands of private dramas and accommodations proceeding in parallel, each unknown to the others, the fog that had attended the beginning of the affair absent now from the streets, though not, I thought, entirely gone from the human matters it had seemed to represent. There are cases whose resolution is clean and absolute, and there are those in which the truth, once established, reveals beneath it a further layer of consequence that cannot be entirely resolved, only acknowledged and lived with. The affair of the Unsigned Confession was of the latter kind, and I was not sure, as I closed my notebook, that this made it a lesser case or a greater one. Holmes was already elsewhere in his mind, and as he so often was within hours of a conclusion, moving through the index of his accumulated knowledge toward whatever problem the city might next produce and deliver, in the fullness of time, to the sitting-room of 221 B. Baker Street. I set my pen aside, extinguished the smaller lamp, and listened for a while to the quiet of the street, and to the fire, and to the occasional low note of Holmes's violin resuming its private, searching inquiry in the room above.